Yes. Okay. Well, good afternoon and very welcome to this workshop on human enhancement, ethics, law and policy of human enhancement technologies. This workshop is part of the task policy discourse on human enhancement technologies integrated in the work package on ethical, regulatory and risk management aspect of STEM project. STEM project is devoted to a technology bidirectional hyper-connected neural systems, and its main researcher, Felipe Barroso, will talk about it in tomorrow's session. Considering this technology as a rehabilitation technology, the general approach of the workshop will be to raise a dialogue and debate between this kind of technologies and what we call human enhancement technologies. These dialogical perspectives offers a suitable framework in which the ethical, legal, and political aspects involved in both types of technologies and in the practical procedures linked to the application that can be accommodated. Under this general consideration, the two sessions of the workshop are oriented towards the definition and precise characterization of rehabilitation procedures and human enhancement procedures, and towards the consideration of particular case studies, projects and concrete experiences in which this characterization is shown. The goal is to limit the confusion, overlapping, and dubious relationships that are too often established between both procedures. Thus, the workshop has a conceptual and contextual character, aimed at setting the general frameworks for the discussion and debate. These frameworks have to do with practices, representations, values, technoscientific communities, and the spaces involved in both kinds of procedures. And on the other hand, is also oriented towards exploring concrete cases of both rehabilitation and enhancement procedures in order to get, in these cases, the general characteristics and differences established. Both procedures, rehabilitation and enhancement, although different, have in common, however, the fact that they use a variety of technologies with very different characteristics, based on materiality, as in the case of traditional mechanic processes, progressively detached from them, as in the case of electronic and digital processes, linked to psychological and data processing software, and others more sophisticated, such as neuromuscular or simply neural interfaces, or also chemical proteins that act in the form of medicines, to mention only the most general typologies. What is normal, what is perfectible, how do these developments affect people with functional diversity, how much of a technological solutionism or determinism are they for social or justice problems? That are questions that we are going to try to answer. Many thanks for all of you to take part in this workshop. We are very grateful with your collaboration and generous participation. And I hope we enjoy this afternoon and tomorrow afternoon dialoguing and debating about these issues that we are interested in. Mario?
Good evening. Now let me tell you about some practical details. As you know, probably each session has 4 presentations. The time for each presentation will be approximately 25 minutes. We have found it preferable that the 4 presentations follow one after the other, so that comments, questions, and discussion comes after the presentations, keeping in mind the content of all of them. If someone has to leave the session early, if you wish, you can post your comments or questions in the chat or ask for the opportunity to speak. At any time, of course, you can use the chat to write comments or questions for the final part of the discussion and debate. And I think that that's all. And maybe Chechu, we could already move on to the first presentation.
Well, we will start with the first presentation due to Stephen Rainey from the Hero Center for Practical Ethics at Oxford University. Many thanks, Stephen, for taking part in this workshop and this debate. We are very grateful for your contribution. And the title of your presentation is Minded Brain, Questions, Brain Data and Agency. you have the word.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. I'll just share my screen now because I have a little PowerPoint presentation. Okay. So I'll need to turn off my camera, actually. Apologies, because my laptop struggles with doing too many things. Where's my option? Yeah, so that's better. Yes, so this is a talk about brain data, essentially, and agency. And I wanted to think about some of so what you just described about the Extend project is very much what I'm interested in, how data features in the story about recording brains and intervening on the mind or the body more generally. So especially because understanding the brain through data has allowed the brain to be considered much more legible than it has in the past, especially through understanding brain data dynamics. We're also moving toward being able to control the brain in a much more fine-grained way than in the past, through stimulation, for instance. And this gives us interesting questions about agency. And what I mean by agency is the capacity for someone to deliberate about what they want to do, or to consider practical problems and essentially to act on their own reasons. And that's a very broad definition of agency, and it's a family of different people. You'll see Kant has a theory like that, and so there's everything right up to Beecham and Childress in their kind of medical ethics. But basically, one's decision-making ought to come from their intentional deliberation about things that they understand well, and that and free from coercion by any means. So the question really I'm looking at here is where brain data fits in this story. That how might brain data boost agency to allow for better or more informed decision making, or to free agents from coercion or restrictions, or how might data on the brain deform agency? So there'll be clear cases where brain data can boost one's capacity to be an agent, and there'll also be others though which raise questions. So I'm thinking about neural recordings and how they can be classified in very fine detail by algorithms, essentially. How features of brain signals, like their frequency or how they co-occur with other signals, or how they repeat over long time scales, that can all be extracted by algorithm. And so a kind of sorting and pattern matching offers the promise to understand more deeply, or to explain perceptual, cognitive, and behavior-related brain activity. And classifying brain activity allows order to be shown through the data in what everyone knows the brain is actually very well ordered, but nonetheless it's extremely complex. And through data, we can see pictures of what's going on in quite an ordered way. So, and because this is like an empirical investigation of what the brain is actually doing, there's a long pedigree of a reinvigorated kind of empiricism about the brain. Data seems to allow us to look at objective dimensions of brain activity and to sort of see what's going on behind the scenes in cognition and behavior. The data can be revealed by the scientific methods of empiricism, which are very well established through recording and through detecting patterns by algorithms. We can detect these aspects of brain activity which are invisible to the human scientist. That's so complex that they can only really be arrived at through data processing means. An example of this comes from compressive big data analytics, or CBDA. And this is where huge data sets of brain data can be automatically sampled and sifted in order to find patterns and associations within them without any particular need to ask a question. So it's just like letting algorithms loose on troves and troves of brain data. And then just by doing that, finding the patterns in there that we didn't even know we were worth looking for. And from those objective patterns that seem to be revealed by just sheer examination of the data, it's as if we don't need theory anymore. We can just look into the brain and find out its secrets, reveal what's really going on. And that would mean it gives unprecedented scope for manipulating the brain as well as recording it. So if you look at the pictures here from an article about forcing brain state transitions, it seems as if we could just pull together all the brain data we have, we could then press the button and data analytics will highlight exactly what's worth investigating further in the brain, because the patterns are in the data there. It just seems as if all the structure and all the cognitive and behavioral correlations that can be found in data are just there and ready to be explored or manipulated. So that, and through modeling these dynamics, the data dynamics in computers, we can get pictures of all sorts of possible brain states without having to look at individual humans. So in a certain sense, the power of the approach, of this sort of data analytic approach, is that it's agnostic about the specific details of, say, which neuron fired when, and it's more about the whole story of how the brain is working and how it can be moved from one state to the other. Kind of redefines brain state from a static time sliced approach to more of a set of probabilities about what brain states can be revealed through data. And you can make predictions about whole brain dynamics based on how patterns of the data interrelate across the brain under different circumstances. So again, this slide shows some images from a paper in which researchers observed subjects as they fell asleep from being wide awake, using arrays of different types of data on wakeful states and on sleeping states and on the transitional dynamics from one state to the other. This can all be modeled, and then a picture can be gained of how the dynamics from one state to the other work. And this opens then the possibility of understanding how brain states shift from one to another, and so the possibility to manipulate those transitions. So if you have the dynamics of wakefulness and sleep transitions understood, then neuroscience could potentially produce technologies capable of prompting transitions between those states. And that would instrumentalize the brain in a way that would, for example, my made-up example here is anesthesia. If we were able to snap the brain from one state to another, a wakeful sleep to a deep sleep state, then it would be a way of approaching anesthesia that didn't rely on drugs. This would essentially be based in data. The datafication of how we understand the brain, coupled with the potential for this whole brain computational modeling, opens the possibility for reimagining the brain altogether, not just as a way of looking at neural correlates of behavior, but as a means of taking control of cognition and behavioral states. So besides the specific applications like this toy example of anesthesia, there's also to think about what it means for agency. If we're able to control the brain in a novel sense, then it means maybe we have the ability to boost agency in ways we hadn't thought of in the past. So perhaps especially with respect to the whole brain computer modeling, the idea of data dashboarding can be seen to arise. So this is something I'm interested in terms of it's kind of a small step to take from seeing brain data as reporting brain states to being adjustable parameters for brain states. If we have a dashboard that offers the chance for dynamic intervention on our own brain states, and that's reified through all this data we've recorded, well, how should we understand that dashboard? The impetus might be that control of the brain seems to offer control of the deliberating machinery that we have, and that's the engine on which our agency runs. So brain control might give us rational control, and with it the ability to actively steer our agency. So rather than having to think about things and deliberate about them and just decide, now it seems like we could have this intervention which would allow us to optimize that very process. And it's certain that data would provide more things for us to intentionally deliberate about. But we might also have to question what it is, how we understand that data. We'll come to that later as well, because I'll talk about a model of collecting brain data to see if we actually understand what we're doing, what we think we're doing. Another dimension in which this data dashboard type thing could be seen as liberating agency is through bypassing undesirable personality traits. If we use the data we have on the brain, maybe we could stimulate our brains into producing better versions of ourselves. So I want to imagine Bob now, rather than just the anesthesia case. Let's imagine it's 40 years from now. Bob has an electromagnetic device that he wears that allows him to just switch brain state, force transitions between different brain states to optimize the way he wants to behave. he's decided that he thinks of this brain tuning as a kind of way, almost as if the same as picking clothes to wear for the day. Who will I be today? I'll stimulate or I'll inhibit brain states to the extent that it makes me be this person or that person. And that would seem in principle possible given what's known about the data collection techniques and whole brain computer modeling, coupled with things like stimulation techniques. So the datafication of how we understand the brain, coupled with the potential for whole brain computational modeling, seems to open this possibility for reimagining the brain as a means for taking control of cognition and behavior and our dispositions even, and with that ourselves, we control ourselves in new ways. If we had a dashboard for our own brains, though, how would we think about that notion? How would we think about it as augmentation in some way? How could we locate the activity that in the data that underlines that very notion about our decisions that we make in order to stimulate and change our brains? Would we think of the data as objective, as reporting a story which we then change? Or would it be more important to think of the subjective apprehension of the data, what we thought of it? Would it be purely instrumental? We would just think about data dashboarding, for instance, as just the same way we would control any machine. Could also be thought of, this idea of changing oneself could be brought in the context of self-expression, refining our own capacities, just like with rehabilitative medicine. If I don't have a personality that allows me to behave a certain way, but I can stimulate my brain to allow for me to behave differently, then why might it be different to, say, having a prosthetic limb? But it isn't completely clear whether this sort of data dashboarding would give me reasons to alter my brain. And given that's an important part of agency, that's an interesting question, whether having a data dashboard is a reason to use a dashboard or whether it's just an opportunity. I think there's actually also a conceptual confusion here, as well as some practical problems. The conceptual issue is about self-making through brain state manipulation. If the brain is used to promote and inhibit states according to our choices, there's still a decision that has to be made to act a certain way, and that has to still be accounted for. So the idea would be that we can't, in all the predictive power we would have about our brain based on the data, we couldn't also predict a decision that was made. If we predict a state that moves from one state to the next, that's just a matter of causality, that's fine. But we couldn't predict a decision to make a state transition from one to the other. So it seems there's a conceptual limit on brain state transition when it comes to self-making. The idea is just essentially that if I predict the decision has been made, then I can no longer decide because it becomes just a matter of causality. It seems to obliterate agency. So the idea of a decision is something that can't itself be predicted. That's a kind of a tricky abstract point, which we can come back to if needs be. But another more practical problem that I think is an interesting one. It comes down to the data collection itself. It's about the sort of topography of brain data collection. If you think of I've got a sort of generic picture of brain data collection here that I've just sort of drawn out, and we're focusing on neuroelectrical activity. So we think about how we would approach recording the brain and collecting data. We'd have a research question that's informed by a bunch of neuropsychological or neurophysiological data, for example. We'd use that to choose sites to record using, and what kinds of recording we'd want to make, whether we want EEG recording or intracranial recording or something like that. We would record, and then we would get neuroelectrical activity in terms of signals. This would be like the context of discovery. This would be the thing that we got in response to our question. Then you'd have to go on to apply techniques to extract relevant data from the signals. So it's a complicated sort of raw signal, and we're interested in only bits of it. So we apply algorithms to it in order to extract relevant data. Those algorithms then produce the data essentially that will be used to treat our questions, but they also inform themselves in terms of learning algorithms. So the datafication of the brain signal makes databases, and the databases themselves go on to inform the algorithms and optimize them further. So it's a kind of a loop starts to emerge in this part where we are actually making the brain signals usable through datafication. Then there are some other complications. I don't know where to put you there. Whenever we use the data, we can use it to predict behavioral activity, or to predict cognitive activity, or to control devices. This is coming from the databases of material that we have. But if you look at the second picture there, there's also the possibility that in having neuro data driven devices, there are then commercial interests that are generated. So that means there's a new dimension of this generalized picture of brain data that becomes monetized, and the data itself becomes monetized. Everybody knows now that companies, big tech companies in particular, really like data. That's what they're interested in. So this idea of data is no longer, it's not quite as neutral as it might have appeared at the start. And that leads to this kind of strange fuzzy line between context of discovery and context of justification. So if we think about how A, C, and D relate here, we can see that the data is playing a role on both sides of the equation. It's informing the data from which research questions are born, which gives rise to the context of discovery. It then operates in a little loop among databases and algorithms, which are sorting the data, which then goes on again to confirm once more the data. So you can see a kind of a circle here, a bit of a loop. And that's just a practical notion of how the data is collected. So it makes us then question, well, what the data is signifying, what's it about? So the topography of the brain data, of brain datafication, here it illustrates how data appears both in the theories that frame the questions and in the methods used to answer them. So the algorithmic processing appears to be deductive in character. It looks like it's extracting material from the brain in a deductive sense, but really it's more of an inductive inference based on data sets that it self-curates. So it's inductive and it works on it sort of marks its own homework. So this doesn't necessarily mean that it's like without value. We know that neuroscience works, for instance. We can say that quite confidently about a lot of things, but we also have to investigate how it works and why it works. Is it working for the right reasons, or is it working for the reasons that we expect? So rather than the liberation of agency in permitting total control over our brains and the effects that control wheels of our perception, thought, and action, what we might have is data dashboarding, which is more like applying a set of templates, generic forms of generic structures and patterns which are applied to brains, and which we apply to our own brain if we're trying to improve ourselves through, like Bob with his machine. But really what we're doing is applying generic types of pattern rather than something of our own. So that would be like applying templates, applying data templates which reflect established data verified by its own standards rather than a boost of our own agency. And with that sort of problematic loop about the data and its self-curation, how it appears on both sides of justification and discovery, the roles of data curation can't really be left out. And that needs to be seriously considered if we're to understand what we're doing with the brain data. A big part of that is the commercial interests which can appear because of neurotechnology and the databases themselves, which are a product, an asset for a big tech company. I mean, if you think about science in general, if it aims at the better understanding of nature, certainly under capitalist societies, that manifests as in a technology industry, which uses the better understanding of nature to create devices that allow better control of nature. And if we think about it, that applied to the brain, that's slightly problematic, and especially if we think about it in terms of agency. Is control of nature the right way to think about trying to boost agency through the use of neurotechnologies? It seems maybe not, because that seems to underplay, or rather ignore, the possibility for coercion, and not in the sense of being forced to do something, but not being permitted to do things but for a certain way. So it's not coercion of being pushed into something, but it's coercion of not having other options available. I mean, a technology industry centered on manufacturing devices to control better understood nature and monetizing the infrastructure could be a way to outline that brain data ecosystem just illustrated there, and that would essentially be a privatization of that if the role of big tech companies was particularly emphasized in the data curation side of things. So there are reasons to think that brain datafication and the use of that data to control the brain could boost agency. So that's the case where you have interventions that like can stop seizures, for instance. That's obviously boosts agency, because someone who would otherwise have an epileptic fit, for instance, and has an electrical stimulation device implanted to forestall the kind of brain overload that would lead to a seizure. If their seizure never occurs because of the use of that device, then their agency is boosted because they're able to act in a seizure-free way. Or if you restore bodily function that's been lost through the use of something like a neuroprosthesis that would allow someone who's lost linguistic ability to speak again. But beyond that horizon, it isn't exactly clear that brain control per se, so brain control in itself, offers particular boosts to agency, in terms of agency as an ability to deliberate and act on one's own reasons. Where deliberation and action are at stake, there is that conceptual limit, I think, on brain prediction as it pertains to decision making. And there are those practical questions about the representational content of brain data, as well as those hidden interests in the nature of its generation. So brain data, I don't think, offers an objective instrumentalization of the brain in ways that some might hope. So the idea of the data dashboard looks, on the face of it, kind of appealing or obviously appealing. But whenever you drill down a little further and think about the concept of agency at work and think about how the data is acquired, it becomes a bit less clear. But the fact, or the contention, that brain data doesn't automatically give you agency boosting control of the brain doesn't necessarily mean that it shouldn't be treated very carefully. I think it's extremely sensitive stuff, and it's powerful, so it should be treated carefully. Essentially, it gives us a good guide to brain function, but the map is not the territory. That's the reference to the underground system there. The map's not the territory, and so how it relates is still up for grabs. We don't look at the metro map and use that as a guide to try and walk from location to location, because it's completely abstracted from the streets. In the same way, brain data is abstracted from what's going on in our brains, or by extension, our reasoning and our deliberation. But what the relation is between that is still up for grabs. That's to be discussed. And given it's still relatively early in the story of brain datafication, and there's still a lot of work to be done, it seems that how to develop good practices for using brain data, how to invigorate the kind of wide-ranging interdisciplinary scrutiny that can produce good processes and approaches to brain data, well, now seems a good time, because it's already happening, yes, but it's still early days. So the development of a kind of critical evaluation of data can co-evolve with the datafication of the brain in itself, including in neuroscientific research in general and in its applications. I think my time is running short, so I'll just leave it there. Thank you for that. And yeah, if there's any questions, particularly about that agency thing, I'd be happy to answer those.
Thank you very much, Stephen. This is a very, very interesting and inspiring talk, because you open a lot of questions about the data resulting from neural recordings and the problems and scope and limits of the treatment of that kind of data in a context not only of research, but also of rehabilitation and also of recreation. So there is the possibility of monetize that kind of data, and that issue is very, very, I am very worried about that. So we can continue the debate at the end of the presentations, and now we are going to pass to Aníbal Estoviza, which is a colleague of our research project STEM, and his presentation is about the ethics of neurotechnologies and artificial intelligence. It could be seen as a complement of the previous presentation. So Aníbal, you have the word.
Okay. Thank you, Stephen, for such an interesting talk. I'm here representing the Extend research project, but I'm not going to talk about the ethical issues raised by STEM technology, but rather I'm going to talk about the ethics of neurotechnology and artificial intelligence in general. although on a last point, I will touch briefly some lessons learned during the running period of the extended research project. So let me show you the plan for today's talk that has 5 points. The first point is just to talk about the basics or the main ideas of neuroscience within the context of neurotechnologies. Some of those ideas have been talked by Stephen, and then some key aspects of AI techniques or algorithms in use in the context of neurotechnologies. And then I will briefly talk about the ethical issues of neurotechnologies in general. Then I will say a little bit about what lies ahead in the future of neurorehabilitation, and then my first person perspective of the extended research project during the running period. Okay, the ABC of neurotechnologies. Well, this is a picture of the neuron and its constituent parts. The neuron is something like an organic computer, a processing unit that approximately we have 82 to 100 billion neurons in our heads, in our brains. According to a central dogma in neuroscience, the neuron is the functional, genetic, and structural unit of analysis of the nervous system. This is the neuron doctrine stated for the first time by Santiago Ramón y Cajal, which says that the neuron is the fundamental unit of analysis of the nervous system. But despite its grandiose, or considering the neuron an organic computer and the most relevant processing unit in the brain, and despite the many differences, shapes, size, and types of neurons, there's no cognition in a neuron. There's no consciousness in a single neuron. Every neuron, or each neuron, needs to interact with other neurons to produce the emerging property or the high-level property of complex cognition and complex behavior. And it's the interaction between different neurons with other neurons that we have the complexities of cognition, attention, language, and complex behavior. So it's from the interaction of neurons that we have, that we display and exhibit the kind of complexities, complex behavior that we humans show. This is a very short clip of neurons interacting with each other, and we see here neurons fighting. No, this is the kind of enchanting loom, as one neuroscientist said, that makes the human being. But before the development of current neurotechnologies and the accumulation of knowledge that now we have, we lack a very complete understanding of what the brain does, but we have now more knowledge than the past, because as these two images show, ancient physicians and ancient scientists use very primitive technology, very blunt technology, such as trepanation, drilling a hole in the skull, just to peek inside what is inside in a brain, and see or trying to know what is going on inside our heads. But for neurorehabilitation, the discovery of electricity and the experiments of Luigi Galvani and others were transformational. For example, Luigi Galvani applied an electrical current to the muscles of the frog, to the muscles of the leg of a dead frog. They provoke a twitch. These experiments put an end to a long-held debate in neuroscience regarding how nervous system communicates, because ancient people believed that there were animal spirits that, or pneuma, the breath of life, that is responsible for the communication within the nervous system. But 200 years after Galvani's demonstration and the technological advances in the stimulation of muscles have had an enormous impact in the life of many people. Now we have electrical defibrillators that are installed in at many places, such as, for example, schools, airports, etc. Enables to restart the muscles of the heart, giving another chance to people who would have what otherwise would be a sure sentence of death. Let me sniff a little bit of the water. Also, we have a more powerful technology, such as functional electrical stimulation, which enables to reanimate the muscles of people who suffer from distinctive forms of paralysis. And skip forward to today, we have new technologies that can be defined as a set of technologies with the capacity to decode and manipulate the brain, which include non-invasive neuromodulation techniques such as scalp-based electroencephalography, or imaging techniques such as positron emission tomography, or even optogenetics that apply a beam of light to switch on and off targeted brain cells in behaving animals. And we can classify neurotechnology in terms of two broad categories. For example, non-invasive neurotechnologies, invasive neurotechnologies. Non-invasive technologies measure and record brain activity from the outside, externally, and invasive technologies, for obvious reason, is too dangerous and risky. This is an abstract depiction of the underlying operation of any type of neurotechnology that involves two operations that lead to mapping, to make a cartography of which brain areas and structures are there in the brain, that in turn leads to the observation or to control behavior. So this abstract depiction is the underlying working of any type of neurotechnology. Neurotechnologies allow us to measure, modulate, that leads to the observation or control of behavior. And now we have the potential to interface humans with technology. The famous tournament and competition known as Cybertron, in which science and athletics are merged, makes it possible to people who suffer from disabilities. Here in the picture, we see someone who is wearing a robotic arm, a prosthesis, because has an amputated arm, recovering the dexterity to even hang clothes. No? And some types of neurotechnologies looks like science fiction. Paraphrasing the famous quote of the science writer Arthur Clarke, any advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. This type of neurotechnology, developed by Jack Gallan and colleagues from the University of California, Berkeley, enables the decodification of the contents of our brains, in particular the contents of conscious visual perception, just by looking at the brain activity. In other words, they tell us what someone is perceiving or seeing just by measuring brain activity. Some people are there to say that this type of new technology is a kind of mind-reading device or brain-reading device. And another astonishing neurotechnology is brain-computer interfaces that enables the possibility to extract information from the nervous system of a living organism and convey that information to external device. Let me show you a very short clip of brain-computer interfaces in action that enable the restoration, enhancement, or improving the mobility of people who suffer from motor disorders, who are unable to move his arms, like in this case, this man who, with the help of a brain-computer interfaces, is handling a fork and stabbing food.
Cook and eat food. Move right hand forward to start. Moving fork to food.
So here in this So
Select
click,
root
you see
location.
a man
Right
who is
hand.
controlling
Forward, back,
the
left,
robotic
right.
arm with his thoughts. Thoughts, that is the brain activity patterns of his brain. Okay, AI in neurotechnologies. Well, with the application of AI techniques, we have too many technical problems, but also ethical problems, as Stephen has commented, because the application of AI algorithms, you don't really know if the AI algorithm or AI technique is picking out the relevant content of the brain signal in order to say that this dashboard type of thing that Stephen commented is really the agent or the user of the new technology in question. With the application of AI algorithms, you have two different processes that feedback on each other, are neural encoding and decoding. Neural encoding is what the brain does, a correspondence between the external world and the brain activity, and decoding is what neurotechnology does, a correspondence between the neural activity and the external world. But decoding can be thought of as a mind reading, since signals about let me see if I can turn off the faces, because it doesn't allow me to read the content of the slide. So some signals about the activity of the brain, the intention precedes the movement. The design of any neurotechnology begins with an interface to the brain. Let me see if I can take out the faces of all the people who is in the audience, because I can read my own slides. So I can continue. Okay. And this interface is very different from what nature does when the nervous system communicates with the body, because for neurotechnology, brain activity needs to be machine readable. It is important to understand the fundamentals of how electrodes translate neural activity into signals that are readable by the machines. And today, machines, computers, and any other type of engineering entity are unable to directly interpret the physiological processes that occur in the nervous system. Those signals can be physical, chemical, or electrical, but needs to be translated into the language readable by digital hardware. In any neurotechnology, but mostly in brain-computer interfaces, there are three differentiated stages or processes. The sensing technology, the electrodes, the amplification stages, that includes some operations like filtering, isolation, linearization, and then the transmission of the signal to a signal processing unit, where the AI algorithms or AI software is taking place, processing the raw signal, treating the brain activity. On the part of the electrodes are sensors that collect signals, and signals represent physiological phenomena, and those signals are quantities that cause and reveal the behavior of the organisms. Here's a picture of one of the main types of electrodes, are known as the Utah microelectrode arrays. And in the amplification stages, amplification is a neural signal, a kind of operation which consists in the amplification of the signal collected from the electrodes. Filtering is another operation that alters the frequency content of this type of signals. And here is where the AI software or AI algorithms are applied in the context of any type of neurotechnology, in the transmission of information to a signal processing unit. And to build the neurotechnology is necessary to the development of decoders, the algorithms that translate this raw signal into interpretable signal or content to perform a functional outcome by the external technological device. And the main goal of decoders algorithms is to enable this direct communication between the brain, computer, and devices. Here is a table showing the main types of algorithms in use in the state of the art, the description, training, and uses, but this is too technical for us. What is most interesting for us is to know the ethical analysis perspective and which ethical issues rise when we are using this type of technology. AI techniques embedded in neurotechnology can potentially override the user's decision-making capacity. And this is very relevant because you never know how accurate or how well is performing the algorithm in picking out the signal and interpreting that signal. Because AI software could predict unintended information, such as the probabilistic risk of having a disease or even predict preferences. Some ethical issues of new technologies, because new technologies can reshape or transform many normatively relevant concepts, such as, for example, agency, like Stephen commented, or even autonomy, responsibility, etc. And because of the risk or the worries in the use of new technologies that promise cognitive and motor rehabilitation, and also intervening, modifying or manipulating our brains, and the science fulfill that promise, the most interesting question is the ethical question. How can we use new technologies in the right way? Concerns have been raised on the possible ethical, societal, and legal consequences of new technologies, which in turn ask for regulation, for standardization, or for the establishment of well-established principles. And now we have multiple guidelines that have been recently released, including the ethically aligned design, the IEE neuroethics framework, and the Neuro Rights Initiative at the Columbia University, which advocates a human rights perspective on the development of these new technologies, and is leading by a Spanish neuroscientist, Rafael Juste, because new technologies raise questions about agency. For example, deep brain stimulation is a kind of neurotechnology that implants some type of electrodes in close contact with the brain for the treatment of impulse control issues, such as, for example, basal ganglia disorders, or tremor, or Parkinson, or dystonia, but also for more complex neuropsychiatric disorders. Deep brain stimulation, or DBS, is used for the treatment of depression and also anorexia nervosa. But the literature, the scientific literature, collects reports from people who were treated with this novel method. They report, or they feel, that their sense of agency is somewhat confused or something strange, because they no longer feel that they are the truly generators of the intention to act, or they have this blunted sense of agency, and they even develop emotional disorders. They become hypersexual. They have many adverse effects with this novel method, including the transformation of the reshaping of normative relevant concepts such as agency, which is a very relevant concept not only in ethics but also in the legal realm. But also, new technologies raise questions about autonomy. Autonomy, we can understand autonomy in a Kantian sense as self-rule or self-legislation, and many people in the literature report that they delegate the autonomy to the machine or to the technological device, and they feel like puppets. Also raise questions about privacy. Now that we are living in an era which puts so much focus on privacy as a core value to protect, new technologies can have direct access to the most important data, the brain data that Stephen talked about, how to manage, how to store, how to share this brain data is very important, because you can harm the individual. You can sell the data to third parties and commercialize that data, monetize that data. The owner of that, or the natural person who the data is coming from, could be harmed because third parties monetize the data, or even disclose to insurance company. It could raise the payments, etc. But also questions about responsibility. Responsibility, for example, can be a kind of tricky notion in the context of new technologies, because who is the one who is the originator of the action? When you have brain-machine interface or brain-computer interface mediated action, you can suffer from an attack from a third party, or a cyber attack. You can no longer say which is the originator of that action. Is the brain of the user of the new technology? Is the someone who brain hack or control externally the technological device? So raise important questions about responsibility and even the diffusion of responsibility. And questions about cognitive enhancement in healthy people. The philosophical movement known as transhumanism believe in the application of science and technology for the enhancement of people and overcoming the limitation of the human condition. There are those who believe in transhumanism and pushing the boundaries of the dissolution of the boundaries between human and machines. There is important question regarding who has access to this technology. They could increase inequalities between those who are enhanced by the technology in contrast to those who are not enhanced by the technology. So new technologies raise very fundamental and important questions of ethics. Now let me talk a little bit about the most technical, well, the technical issues regarding what lies ahead in the future of neurorehabilitation. But let me now contextualize the different problems that people can suffer from spinal cord injuries. Spinal cord injuries are a trauma to the spinal cord that prevents or disrupts the pathways in the brain to the muscles. That leads to muscle weaknesses or even paralysis. The main causes of disabilities or spinal cord injuries are motor vehicle accidents, falls, acts of violence, and even sports. And many scientists believe that the brain evolved to control movement, rather than thinking that the purpose of the brain is to control thinking or to control cognition. The primary purpose of the brain is control movement. And many others establish a link between cognition and movement. They echo the words of the father of psychology, William James, that suggested that the cognition is just actions, performing an action in the contents, in the representational content of the reason abilities. And researchers Amir and Ahmed speculate that the future technologies could be capable of predicting our preferences by just measuring our movements. They hypothesize movement kinematics equals subjective economic value. They believe that the strength, the intensity, the vigor of our movements reveal what we value. So they put this kind of analogy we run towards our loved ones, but we barely move when we don't want to do something. So they think that some kind of technology in the future can predict our preference just by looking at our movements. And many other scientists are using virtual reality for motor rehabilitation. So they put people in an immersed virtual reality environment just to see how they respond to stimuli that they can no longer respond. Wearable robotic technology, the scientists use exosuits or exoskeletons to restore the functional ability of people who suffer from motor disorders, but this kind of technology can be moved beyond the clinical settings in the context of the work environment for workers to carry heavy loads, etc. And also the use of the smartphone as a kind of motion measurement system or virtual physical assistant. For example, Althoff and colleagues analyze the smartphone sensor data for activity patterns in more than 600,000 people in different countries. They conclude that activity inequality predicts some health issues such as obesity. Now I will talk about some first perspective experience from being part of the ethics research group associated with the extend technology, which the ethics research group I'm involved with is in charge of analyzing the social, ethical, and legal aspects of extend technology. This is a picture took during one of the annual meetings held at the Center for Social Science and Humanities in Madrid. You can see all the logos of the partners of the consortium. There are academic institutions, private companies. What I learned from this experience is the cooperative work. Cooperation between engineers, technicians, neurologists, clinicians is the only way to produce, in this case, a research project, an outcome, a technology that is for the benefit of all. This is a paradigmatic case of consilience, this work coined by Edward Wilson, in which there is a unity of knowledge between different disciplines. So just to recap, new technology needs to be human-centered because nanotechnology, its core value is to explore and understand the values of the people who are going to benefit from it. Ethics matters. Ethics is not a hindrance or something to exclude, but if you want to do responsible research and innovation, ethics matters because ethics is the only way to do the right thing. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Aníbal, for your passionate presentation, as usual, and it's quite interesting. I have some questions. Is quite. I really agree with you with the issue of neurotechnology human-centered. But it seems to me that your view of cognition is brain-centered, not human at a whole, body-centered. So, well, we could discuss at the end. Felipe, you want to say something?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, no, I just sent you the link that you said in the chat that sport is not good. But yeah, the researchers from CSIC show that it is actually very nice for the brain.
Yes, but moderate physical exercise.
Yeah, it was moderate.
It seems to me.
Yeah, it was with mice here in the Cajal Institute, and now they are doing that with people just to show the benefits. Yeah, moderate exercise.
Okay.
You are safe. You are safe. You are safe with the.
Okay. I try to do only moderate physical exercise. Well, The third presentation is due to Marcos Alonso. Marcos is professor of the Adolfo Ibáñez University in Chile. He is PhD from the Complutense University in Madrid. He has worked a lot about relations between technology, philosophy, and the issue of identity. So his talk today is about personal identity, authenticity, and brain affecting technologies. So Marcos, you have the word.
Well, hi everyone. Thanks everyone for participating, and particularly thanks to Chechu for organizing this and inviting me. I also wanted to start saying sorry for everyone that is talking tomorrow, because I won't be attending the talks, at least most of the talks, because I have class all afternoon. I won't be able to be there. It's a shame. Yeah, I will definitely try to watch it and listen to it afterwards, but sorry in any case. So let me share this presentation. Very simple presentation. Okay. So yes, as Chechu was hinting, I've been working on this issue of personal identity for some time, and the reason or the motivation for me to keep working on this and relating it to this topic of what I call brain affecting technologies is well, basically because Chechu told me about this extend project, which I find very, very interesting and very successful in general. And well, I remember about this topic of authenticity, particularly, that it has been on my mind for some time, but never really had time to work on it extensively. And well, I decided that this would be a very good opportunity to do so. And in any case, obviously, as you will see, this is a work in progress. I'm not really an expert yet in this topic. This is not an expert presentation as the ones from Stephen and Aníbal, but I hope you can find some interesting things in it. I think it's going to be much shorter, much more brief. But well, in my time in philosophy, I have also learned to be very worried when someone says that they are going to be brief. That usually means quite the opposite. So I will not say it and just start with the presentation. So yeah, everybody probably knows about these brain affecting technologies that I'm going to talk about deep brain stimulation, about brain-machine interfaces. If they didn't know, the presentation of Aníbal was very clear in this respect. I'm not going to delve on it. I just want to define what this means. Obviously, brain affecting is a very general term. In a sense, all technologies are brain affecting, but I imagine you capture what I'm trying to say when I say brain affecting, this directly brain affecting technologies. And one of the questions that maybe we will return to is if this is something really relevant, or is just something not very important, the fact that it's directly affecting technologies, if other technologies or other realities are affecting in a similar way. Does this matter ethically? Well, we will return to this point. Okay, so first of all, deep brain stimulation, as I said, I'm not going to delve on it. Aníbal explained it much better than what I could. As you can see, we have coordinated our presentations. We are using the same images, and this is obviously very intentional. And well, deep brain stimulation, as the name itself is explaining, is an invasive neurosurgical procedure that has been used to treat diseases such as Parkinson's disease, as depression, and others Aníbal also mentioned. yeah, well, you can see here an image of someone that has undergone this procedure, and brain-machine or brain-computer interfaces are similarly devices that aim to connect the brain to prostheses, exoskeletons, computers, and their objective is to improve the functionality of people with some kind of movement limitation. They can be invasive, like deep brain stimulation, but they can also be non-invasive, as it has been mentioned. So here you have also an image of someone using this non-invasive brain-computer interface. So these are the technologies that, in a sense, are raising some ethical questions, some very important ethical issues. Yeah, Aníbal talked about agency, autonomy. Maybe those are the more pressing ones, the more important ones, but I would like to focus on personal identity and authenticity. As Aníbal also mentioned, especially deep brain stimulation, but in some respect, all these brain affecting technologies can have some side effects that affect at least personality. We are going to discuss if it really comes to affect personal identity or even authenticity. These, the users, the patients that are using deep brain stimulation or even brain-machine interfaces, but more importantly, the brain stimulation sometimes report a feeling of strangeness after surgery. They say things like, I don't feel like myself. They even sometimes say that I feel like a robot. And this is the thing that I wanted to delve on, I wanted to discuss, relating it to these personal identity issues. There are also other side effects like slurred speech, like mania, and some major personality changes as impulsivity, hypersexuality, as Aníbal referred to. But these previous statements, these reports of not feeling like myself, or feeling like a robot, is what I would like to reflect upon, that I would like to consider philosophically. So the main question I would like to present, that I would like to at least try to answer, is, can technologies of this type, these brain affecting technologies, radically change a person? Can they cause someone to stop being him or herself? Okay, so this directs us to personal identity. Personal identity, and I don't want to extend too much on it, but just to give a very brief consideration, personal identity is generally seen as an important aspect of ethics. In a very direct sense, who I am is directly related with my values, with my purposes, etc. The concept of personal identity, the idea that I am a unique being, that I'm different to the rest, that my existence extends over time, is essential for understanding our moral world. We use it all the time, and it's very near for us. So I just thought about two very stupid examples. For example, if I'm not the same person as yesterday, if I don't have this personal identity, no one could ask me to pay my debts. In a very similar sense, if I couldn't recognize my plumber, I wouldn't let him destroy my house. I would immediately call the police if I see someone doing these things to my house. So personal identity, as Maria Shetman says, serves as a minimum condition in the assessment of responsibility, obligation, and certain sorts of entitlement, or practices of promising, contracting, and assessing praise or blame depend on this notion. Also, as Charles Taylor says, Charles Taylor has worked also extensively in this notion of authenticity. As he says, and I think this is a very clear definition, also very bright idea, he says that our personal identity allows us to orient ourselves in the moral world in the same way that our physical capacities allow us to orient ourselves in the physical world. So this is, as I was saying, the main point, the first definition. Of course, there are many things that we could say about identity. In a previous talk, as some of the listeners here know, I was talking about all the different views on identity, about psychological identity, about the animalistic view on identity, narrative identity. This would be really interesting, but I don't think the inclusion and the discussion of these things is granted right now. I just want to keep ourselves in a very basic notion of personal identity. In any case, one thing that should be noted is that personal identity does not identify with personality. Of course, they are related, but we cannot understand them as the same term. One example, I think, is very clear. For example, if we think about this plumber that I was talking about, if he starts doing his job and in the middle of his job he gets depressed, maybe he loses one of his children or whatever. If he gets depressed, if his personality changes radically, I'm not going to refrain from paying him. He's still the same person. Even if he has changed a lot, he's still the same person. His identity hasn't changed. So yeah, personality is not the same as personal identity. Even if sometimes we talk in these terms, we say someone who has changed drastically in their personality, we say he's not the same person. He has changed so much that he's a different person. But obviously, we are talking metaphorically, although metaphors carry a lot of weight, and well, this could be a very interesting discussion. But at least preliminarily, let's assume that personality does not equate to personal identity. So, leaving that aside, let's get to authenticity, which is also an ethically relevant term, but I would say not so much considered, and I would say also much more complicated, much trickier than personal identity. A tentative definition of being authentic could be just to be true to yourself. Being authentic could be to live in a sense of truthfulness, living in accordance to one's true self. This is obviously very, very vague. This is one of the main problems with authenticity, that means many different things, and most of the things it means is not very, very clear. But the main point is that authenticity is linked with this idea of ethical truthfulness, of living truthfully. We talk about authenticity in other regard. We, for example, say that a watch can be authentic or it can be a falsification. For example, here in this image, we have a false Rolex in the right hand, and a real Rolex, an authentic Rolex in the left hand. We place much more value in authentic things than in false things, in falsifications. And in a sense, this is also what happens with personal authenticity. We place value in authenticity. We believe that authenticity is something good, something valuable, that honesty, integrity, truthfulness are good things, whereas acting falsely, acting in a fake manner, acting fakely, is considered despicable, even to the point that someone who is not authentic could be ostracized, could be socially repudiated, could bring many problems with it. So yeah, obviously, as I was saying from the beginning, authenticity is a very problematic term. Authentic things like the watch, like the Rolex that I mentioned, is not the same as authentic persons. But yeah, okay, let's just leave it there. Maybe we can return to it later. The idea of authenticity is basically this, and it's related to many ethical debates, and especially debates around human enhancement. Human enhancement, which everyone here knows what is about, brings the possibility or discusses about the possibility of many modifications. What human enhancement discusses is what are the ethical implications and the ethical underpinnings of these proposed changes or even actual changes that are operating right now. So the point and the reason why human enhancement brings these authenticity issues is because we ask ourselves if these changes, if these modifications would alter ourselves to the point that we stop being who we are, we abandon our true self and become unauthentic. This is a possibility. This is something that authors have pointed out to, and is a valid consideration, I would say. For example, Bolt says that enhancement can break our connection to reality, and in a very similar way, Parents states that enhancement could separate us from who we really are and how the world really is. So this is the concern. This is, I would say, a valid concern, but ultimately, I think this is a somewhat misguided concern. I think these kind of positions have two main problems. For once, they fail to take into account the dynamic nature of personal identity and also authenticity. And second, they defend what I believe is an unrealistic notion of truthfulness. So if we return to our initial question, we can ask, can brain affecting technologies be a threat to our personal identity or to our authenticity? If we tackle these questions separately, I think we should say that personal identity is not really affected by or threatened, better said, by these technologies. Of course, we can say, or we can understand, this depends very much on our understanding of personal identity. We could think of someone that is very timid, very introvert, and suddenly after these brain affecting technologies becomes someone really extrovert, really impulsive. His personality changes so much that we are inclined to say that we are at a different person. But is this really so? As I was saying, from a static view of personal identity, essentialist view of personal identity, we could maybe say that yes, this person has changed, but our moral and our legal practices even say otherwise. We wouldn't stop paying our debts even if this personality change was very profound and very drastic. Contrary to this, a dynamic understanding of personal identity would simply allow a lot of these changes to happen and still maintain the personality. This is what many authors have defended. For example, Francois Baylis, which has worked a lot on these topics, defends that really, in the end, what matters is whether, and if so, to what extent, an event or experience is integrated consciously or unconsciously into identity constituting narrative. This is a citation from her. And the point is, and I also think this is important, that if we do not embrace this dynamic view on identity, we should start, or we would be forced to consider virtually all our life events as possibly identity changing. Falling in love could be identity changing, having a child could be identity changing, and even less important events could also be considered identity changing, but this is highly implausible. Authenticity, on the other hand, and I'm just going to finish with this point, authenticity is a more complicated matter. I believe, as I was saying, that authenticity rhetoric introduces an understanding of truthfulness that is too vague or directly unrealistic. It is true that we are used to operate and to talk about truthfulness. We say that someone is acting fake when they don't behave as we expect. we tell people just to be yourself, even if we don't really know what that means. But in any case, if we focus on it and really examine it, we see that authenticity is problematic. Some authors, as David de Gracia, defend that this idea of a hidden self is most likely a fiction, which I find a not implausible position. Other philosophers, as the aforementioned Charles Taylor, say that we should think about authenticity in a relational way, and I also I also find this very, very interesting and very approvable. Taylor says that authenticity must not be in a solipsistic way, but in a relational way, highlighting and giving a lot of importance to the collective and to the others that surround the person itself. This finding, this understanding of authenticity would be in line with some psychological findings that show how the idea of true self is connected not so much to an inner and true self, but to some features that we tend to understand as intrinsically valuable. We say someone is authentic when we find them as someone nice, altruistic, and generally sociable. Jonathan Pugh and his collaborators talk about, for example, the transformation of Ebenezer Scrooge in A Christmas Carol. The point here is that this character undergoes a very drastic personality change, but we feel it is authentic because the change is from a greedy and misanthropic person to a generous and philanthropic character. So we find this authentic, even if the transformation, as I was saying, is very drastic and very dramatic. So the point, with this I'm going to finish, is the underlying question, I would say, is how important authenticity really is. How important it is in ethical debates, in debates regarding human enhancement, and in general, how important it is in ethics, and also how important authenticity should be. I think this is a pertinent question. Of course, I don't want to downplay the importance of authenticity, and as I was referring to some cases of the side effects of deep brain stimulation, they are very important. They change dramatically someone. We can imagine any person that becomes hypersexual, and this is very socially unacceptable. This is very complicated, but in any case, first of all, we must, of course, consider and examine everything case by case. I don't think we can postulate any great general idea about what is right or wrong in this regard. But even trying to go further from this obvious realization, I believe we must not use authenticity as this totem or as this very big word that make us stop from thinking. I think we should weight authenticity with other factors, and we should, as I was saying, consider each case individually. We can ask, for example, if a person who basically cannot live because it's tremors, because their physical impairing, it is better to live like that with those physical problems, or a person who can live but is inauthentic, that is socially, let's say, repudiated. I would say, and this is the conclusion, even if it's obviously very open-ended, I would say that sometimes it could be better to be less yourself, but be better. In this regard, I also think that it's important for the human environment, for the family and friends, to learn to be compassionate and not start saying and start complaining about someone, about some familiar or friend of being inauthentic. Of course, these side effects can be very problematic, but I would say that they must also learn to be compassionate and understanding. So, okay, I will finish here. I think I have not used much more than 25 minutes, even though I thought that I would use only 10 or 15 minutes. But many other things could be said. In any case, thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Marcos. You have opened very big questions about our identity and authenticity related to this kind of technologies and interventions. So we have room to debate after. The last talk of this afternoon is due to Belén Liedo and John Rueda. Belén Liedo is a PhD candidate at the Complutense University of Madrid, and he is researcher and predoctoral researcher at our group of applied ethics at the Institute of Philosophy of the SIC. And John Rueda is PhD candidate at Granada University at the ethics group there. So they are going to present in defense of post-human vulnerability. You have the word.
Okay, so can you hear me right?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much, Chechu. First of all, we want both to thank the organizers of this workshop, and especially Chechu for counting always on us. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Now you can see my screen, right? Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so this is an investigation we conducted almost a year ago during the spring quarantine last year, and that you can find the extended version of this presentation we are going to do here in an article which is now in press, and we hope will come up soon in Scientia et Fides. The main question we wanted to ask in this article, and we are going to try to answer here, is this one: is there an incompatibility between the acknowledgement of human vulnerability and the transhumanist project per se? Even if, as you will see, this is maybe a more abstract topic than the other ones we have heard today, I think it would be a good, there would be a continuity with the presentation done by Marcos and ours. So I hope it would be also interesting. This article and this investigation is written in controversy with this article by Michael Hauskeller. You can find there in the bottom of the slide, which is called Ephemeroi, Human Vulnerability, Transhumanism, and the Meaning of Life. In this article, Michael Hauskeller argued that, first of, on the one hand, transhumanism ultimately is a quest for human invulnerability or for post-human invulnerability. And on the other hand, that vulnerability is an essential feature of humans. So it could be undesirable to pursue something such as invulnerability. That is, Hauskeller argued, transhumanist project is not desirable in itself. We do agree that vulnerability is a key feature of human life and valuable from an ethical point of view, but we do not agree with the idea that there is something in transhumanism in itself that could be at odds with any version of human vulnerability, of vulnerability in general. So our answer to this first question would be no. Of course, there's some version of transhumanism that maybe maintain a problematic position towards human vulnerability, trying maybe to deny it or to obscure the importance of this phenomenon in human life. But there is also the possibility, we are going to defend, there is a possibility for a vulnerability-friendly transhumanism. So for doing that, the structure of our talk would be this one. First of, I'm going to propose some clarification on the concept of vulnerability, and I'm going to present you the concept we feel it's better for this discussion. Then John Rueda is going to present the two versions of transhumanism we worked about. This is a strong version and a weak version of transhumanism, and the relations, the role of vulnerability in each of them. And finally, also John Rueda will present some conclusion we are arrived to. So this is the first question, the conceptual question. First of all, vulnerability can refer to the ontological characteristic of human beings. This is the concept Hoskeller aligned with. In this article I cited before, he talks about existential vulnerability. And this is a concept really akin with the idea of ontological vulnerability some other authors have talked to. I have to say also that Hoskeller is not the only author, as you all know for sure, that has proposed that there is this incompatibility between transhumanism and vulnerability. There are other authors that have also talked about this problem. So this idea of ontological vulnerability is the idea that we as humans are all fragile, mortal, susceptible to harm, and exposed to certain dangers. This would be, and this is an defining category, and there are a lot of philosophers, in fact, in all history of philosophy, that have proposed that this is a defining issue for human life, that we are defined by our mortality, or we are defined by our imperfection, or some other versions. So Hoskeller and other authors, in fact, are all in a tradition of philosophy that are not that new. Maybe there are new conception of that, or new ways of saying, but there is a long tradition of this idea. But there is also the idea that vulnerability is something socially constructed and dependent on social structures. This is an idea that has been more developed in recent applied ethics literature, and that talks more about the situations of vulnerability one can face depending on these social structures. For example, a woman can be more exposed to sexual harassment than a man due to gender inequalities. We can find a lot of examples of that. It is true that this idea has been criticized and have some problems. We have no time to develop here, but we think that it's important to have in mind this importance of the social dimension of some vulnerabilities, and in consequence their contingent reality. And also, I think it's interesting to mention here that even if we talk here we talk about human vulnerability, vulnerability does not need to be a human category. It's not a necessarily human category. In this sense, it is interesting to talk about, for example, the vulnerability of institution, of the vulnerability of the environment, as Chechel has recently talked about, for example, among other authors. And this is interesting here because, as we are going to argue later, there is no beforehand argument for denying the possibility of a post-human vulnerability, because vulnerability is not a human exclusive category. this is a part of what it is the vulnerability, like the exposure to certain perils. But we are very interested in highlighting the other side of the coin of vulnerability. Vulnerability can be understood as a limitation, as a problem, as something we need to struggle with, but it is also part of our open and creative condition as human beings. That is the same humanity that make us capable of creating and changing the environment and ourselves is the same condition that make us vulnerable to the world, because our fate is not written, for saying So we are vulnerable because we have an open-ended condition. This is something already stated, I think, very inspiringly by Nussbaum in the 1980s. And also it is the reason because of our vulnerability, we need to modify our environment, and we need to modify ourselves also with different means. We have modified our environment through a lot of means. We have modified ourselves through education, through institutions, through different human techniques, and especially we have used technology in all this pursuit in human history. So there is no a priori, we can argue that there is no difference, qualitative difference between some uses of technology or others. Of course, we can discuss this a lot, but we want to align with this idea that we do modify our environment because we are vulnerable, and this is something we have also always done in human history. And also because we are vulnerable, we need to associate with each other and to care for each other. And this is one step more, because okay, association is needed for us for our survival, but care is a need, and also we think that it is something with an intrinsic moral value. Care is the source of well-being and satisfaction for human beings. Also, of course, it can be the source of danger, of peril, and of harm also. It can be the source of a problematic relationship between humans. This is obvious. But good care, we do think that has intrinsic moral value. And this is something we should have in mind when thinking about the future we want for human species. So there is, in history, there is this quest for reducing harm and peril. Acknowledging vulnerability does not mean to accept the way things are. Okay, we are vulnerable, we suffer, this is why we are human, and that's all. Acknowledging vulnerability also means tackle vulnerability and facing vulnerability and associating for managing vulnerability as best as we can. So this facing of vulnerability can be done by technological means, and in fact has been done by technological means in different moments of history. I know here we are approaching the complicated issue of the distinction, therapy, enhancement, etc. We have no time neither to talk about this here, but I know Blanca Rodriguez together for sure will shed light on this topic. So our first thesis here is that assuming human vulnerability, which is an objective we agree with, does not mean and should not mean renounce it to this socio-technological aim in human history of reducing harm and peril through different human means. So now I think I have not speak too much for the time we have, and I'm going to pass the word to my colleague John Reda.
Hi all, thanks Belen for presenting our first part of our paper. Chechu, I would like to know how much time do we still have to finish this presentation? 10 minutes, all right. Thanks, Belen. So in the second part of this article, we think that it is necessary to distinguish between different forms of transhumanism. There is no doubt that transhumanism has been often perceived as a paradigm incompatible with vulnerability, but we think that there are different types of transhumanism. Transhumanist movement is a very plural ideology, and we think that we need a fine-grained analysis to avoid lumping together different conceptions, particularly because we think that Michael Hoskerer and other commentators engage in a radical sort of transhumanism when they are analyzing vulnerability, especially when they are objecting transhumanist proposal on the grounds that they could erode the value of vulnerability. So if we make this distinction, we think that it is true that on radical versions of transhumanism, ontological vulnerability is diminished, even if it is not completely eradicated, because we argue that it's not possible to have an invulnerable post-human existence. And we also concede that in this strong version of transhumanism, there is a risk of fostering some concrete type of social vulnerabilities. On the other hand, we are going to defend that on a moderate version of transhumanism, these objections is not very strong. Particularly, we are going to defend that using enhancement technologies could be respectful for human vulnerability, and that it should be respectful with human vulnerability, because we think that vulnerability is one of the bases of caring relationship and our social interdependent relationships. So now in the next slide, we are going to start addressing what we understand as radical transhumanism. We think that some authors in the transhumanist literature, for example, Nick Bostrom, Max Moore, or David Pearce, they have offered a very strong version of the enhancement project. In those versions, we think that enhancement is a very future-oriented discussion. We think that transhumanism in this radical version could be understood under the paradigm of long-termism. That is that we should direct our current actions in consideration of the impact of the very distant future. That is, we should enhance considering our results in the very long run. And in this sense, transhumanism is oriented towards some far-reaching evolutionary stages that start from the human. For transhumanists or radical transhumanists, human existence is not the endpoint of evolution. It is not bad, not a very defective kind of existence, but it is a good starting point to start directing our own evolution to arrive to transhuman existence, and more in the distant future to a kind of post-human being. Transhumans in this context are considerably enhanced humans, which are not very far from us, from its predecessors, and they could exceed us in cognitive, emotional, and physical abilities, and also in health plans. And they could be in some kind transitional humans. Posthumans, on the other hand, they could be they could really surpass human general capacities in cognition, emotion, health span. They could be also a disembodied kind of existence if some kind of speculative technologies such mind uploading could be a reality. And we think in these depictions of transhumanism, it is true that ontological vulnerability, or at least human type vulnerabilities, could be diminished. We concede that to the critics of enhancement based on the objection of vulnerability. And we also think that we should rethink social vulnerability in the context of radical enhancement. Some authors, for example, pro-enhancement authors such as John Harris has warned about the creation of a new breed through genetic engineering techniques. Another pro-enhancement author such as Milister Silver also warned about the creation of a population divide between gen-rich and gen-poor populations. And of course, strong opponents of enhancement, such as Fukuyama, has said that genetic enhancement could lead to a full-scale class war. And George Arnaz, in a more speculative way, he said that it could even lead to the violent genocide of the inferior human species. We see that some of these points are speculative, but even that, we think that we can think that enhancement technologies in the very radical version could lead some kinds of strengthening of social vulnerabilities in the future. And having said that, we think that it is possible to envision a more moderate version of transhumanism that is devoid of those characteristics that we have presented in the previous slide. And we think that this characteristic, or the characteristic that should be excluded, should be evolutionary eagerness. That is, it is true that the pace of natural evolution is unhurried, and some of our biological characteristics are the results of random mutations. But we think that it is not a very appealing characteristic of transhumanism, that of directing our own bioevolution, because we think that we could leave half of our humanity behind. We think also that there has been some kind of high-tech enhancement fetishism, or we have called it that way, because there is a technophilic attitude in the strong version of transhumanism that may lead to bias or to have a bias in favor of cutting-edge technological interventions. And we are not opposing biomedical enhancements. I personally argue for some very concrete types of biological enhancement, but when we approach the transhumanist debate, we should first accept that the most successful interventions, or those that have the best pedigree, have been social and environmental interventions, and those are the practices that have raised to more human welfare. So we need to avoid a bias towards high-tech enhancement proposals, and we have also to avoid the utopian commitments of the radical version of transhumanism. There are very specific texts from Max More, for example, Letter to Mother Nature, or also Nick Bolson published Letter from Utopia, and those are examples of passionate missives about an idyllic post-human future, and we think that they are not very convincing, because they could lead also to a progress bias, enhancement proponents has been very good at pointing out at the status quo bias of the opponents of enhancement, but we also have to avoid a progress bias that is in from some radical transhumanism. And we think that this second version, more modern version of transhumanism, could be a good kind of using enhancement technologies to mitigate some kind of vulnerabilities. And this is in consonance with the spirit that Belén has said before, that historically there is a long-standing tradition in humanity that is avoiding to try suffering, avoiding harm and peril, and to fostering welfare. And we think that human enhancement technologies could be good at that point, but that they should not endanger vulnerability. Because or why they should not endanger vulnerability? We think that vulnerability is a valuable characteristic of human life, and also probably about of post-human life, at least because two reasons. On the one hand, we think that care relationships are based in some way in human vulnerability. We care to others not only because we are attached to others, but also because they are vulnerable, and also because we are vulnerable. And we create institutions to protect our vulnerabilities. And also because we think that vulnerability is also on the grounds of our social interdependence. And finally, we would like to conclude following Bostrom, who published a very inspiring article about in defense of human dignity, in which he defended that dignity was not a human exclusive category, and that posthumans could also have their own dignity, and thus dignity could not be an objection to enhancement proposal per se. And we think that it could be the same in the debate about vulnerability and transhumanism. We also think that human enhancement technologies may lead to some changes in our current vulnerabilities of our human existence, but surely they possibly create new ones. We also would like to say very clearly that posthumans, they will be certainly vulnerable in both ontological and social sense. And finally, that human enhancement technologies are a good option to think or open the debate about what are the vulnerabilities that we want to tackle first when having the opportunity. We would like also to thank our funding institution. Belén Liedo thanks to the FPU Fellowship of the Ministry of Universities of Spain, and I would like to thank La Caixa Foundation for my funding. And we, of course, thanks to our organizer, to Chechu and Mario and Danny for organizing this meeting, and also to the people that have read this version of the manuscript. We sent it to Hoskeller, who was our main container of that article. We received a lot of feedback from him, but also from Pablo García Barranquero, Francisco Lara, which are here, and other Spanish authors. And thanks to all for your attention.
Well, thanks a lot for you, for all of the speakers, for such an inspiring presentations. It seems to me that we have a lot of topics for dialogue and conversation. We have room now for that dialogue, and at first stance, you together can put some questions to other speakers whoever of the presence of the people connected to this workshop can do her or his questions, or if someone wants to do the first question. No one. I have a lot of questions, but I don't want to monopolize the debate. The debate.
Here, Chechu, I have 2 questions, if I can.
Good, Pablo.
Okay. One is to Marcos Alonso, and it's about the relationship between the personal identity and authenticity, because I don't know what is the real difference between this concept, because I was thinking about one paper of Michael Hoskeller, who was in Belén and John Rueda presentations, about the difference between an original and a copy of a book. And he was only debating about the concept of personal identity or identity. And I don't know if when you introduce this new concept, authenticity, what is the role in the debate? Because more or less all the all the meanings that you I was using can reduce in a big picture of personal identity. So could you explain me more about the difference between 2 concepts, or we can't consider it a subclass or other category of personal identity, authenticity? And only a comment to Belén and John, because I totally agree with your paper, because I read during the quarantine, because I remember the one paper of Mark Kokelberg in 2011, is vulnerable cyborgs learning to our dragons, or maybe. And when Hoskeller is thinking about vulnerability, from my view, he's focusing only in the body. So when transhumanism is transcending or biological boundaries or chains, the vulnerability is going on. This is a very narrow approach, because we have a new ways, for example, for dying. And I don't know if you were thinking about the difference between indefinite life and immortality in transhumanist perspective, because more or less your division between a strong and weak perspective could be very analogous to a division between an indefinite and immortality, because the gap between these scopes are or is in more cases the body or the biological component, and nothing else. Thank you for all the talk, and when you want.
Well, Marcos, you want?
Sure. Well, thank you for the question. Of course, these are topics that should be defined more precisely, and probably would need hours to delve fully on these things. But yeah, the difference, at least on first instance, is very simple. I mean, you can be, for example, Pablo, that's your personal identity. And if you go through, let's say, a brain transplant, in an animalistic account of personal identity, you can become someone else. For example, you become Pedro, you are a different person because of these changes in your body. Yeah. So that could be what personal identity is about, at least from this animalistic account. From psychological accounts, it could be a little bit different, but well, yeah, you get the point about how identity can change. Authenticity is at least like I'm saying, first instance, something different. You can still be Pablo. You are a conscientious and hardworking and passionate person, but then something happens and you become lazy. You don't work. You are bored, and yeah, you are still Pablo. You maintain your personal identity, but people will say that's not really Pablo. That's not his authentic self. So that would be the difference, but I'm not sure if I'm getting your point, if I'm answering your question. This is at least what it's pretended to be. Of course, you can argue that yeah, this definition of authenticity or the definition of personal identity is problematic, but at least that could be the on principle difference.
Well, Belén, John.
Okay, gracias. Thank you, Pablo. And thank you especially because I totally forgot to cite Kokelberg, who is obviously cited in our article, and he's one of the authors were more inspired by. You mentioned an article, which I think is from 2011, but there's also a book, Human at Risk, from 2013. I think a great book. There is some theses from him which are we are very we feel close to, especially the idea that we always tackle our vulnerabilities and create new ones. That is, we for example, there is a great example with the climate change. We have fight the vulnerability, our vulnerability, for example, to cold weather, and also our inability to travel long distances. And as a result of what we have done with these circumstances and a lot of other things, now we are vulnerable to all the consequences of climate change, and we need to rechange our adaptation to the world and readapt the world to us. So thank you for this, because it's a very important reference in our article. And about the important Hauskeller gives to the body, we do address that in the article also. Also the idea of perfection and the mind uploading and the relation with the immortality. But I'm sure John will answer this better if he wants to.
Yeah, sure. I have a follow-up comment to respond to Pablo. Yeah, we think that at some point, some radical transhumanist proposals have searched, or at least imagine, a kind of disembodied existence, because as Bostrom said, the body is a death trap. So yeah, one of the problems is the body, the human body. And because of that, mind uploading has been one of the most famous transhumanist proposals. And in that case, in the case of mind uploading, we do not like to talk about immortality, because immortality by definition means the impossibility of death. We think that a more accurate concept in that case could be immortality, because posthumans, even if they are uploaded into a virtual cloud, an Android, a supercomputer, will still have present the possibility of death, either as an optional choice or as an external menace. And in that point, we followed Kokelberg, because for Kokelberg, some external risks could make posthuman existence still vulnerable to death. So yeah, thanks for your inspiring question.
Okay, there are more questions.
I have a question.
Okay, venga, Paco.
Really, I have many questions, because
a lot
of many issues interesting. But I had to choose one, and then I would like to ask to Alonso one thing. It's not a question, really. It's a suggestion. Marcos, I don't understand why you end up with a notion of authenticity that is a bit far of from your start point, because at the beginning, you have a notion of personal identity is very, very open. I agree with this conception, this no essentialist conception of personal identity. We create identity day by day. I agree. But then I don't understand why you go looking for a solution in Taylor, because Taylor is an author with a substantive idea about the good life. Then I wonder if it would possible to link this open notion about personal identity with other open conception of authenticity. For example, authenticity as self-determination, as autonomy. Could we identify the real self with the self-determination? In this sense, I would behave authentically when I follow values that I have thought about. In this way, the brain technologies you mentioned could be ethical depending not on what changes they produce in the subject's personality, but in how the subject can assume those changes, if these changes are the result of a process where the subject participates. I think that changes should allow the individual to think about the changes and have the option of stopping or reversing the process. Moreover, the changes should be gradual so that it doesn't abruptly affect the narrative of the personal identity. In this case, it's possible, I think, to have a other, more open conception of the authenticity, where we can manage different conception of the good life. In the case of Taylor, this is not possible, because Taylor has just one conception of the good life. Do you understand? What do you think about this, Marcos?
Well, thank you for the long comment. Yeah, maybe I kind of said it inadvertently, but I'm not really defending Taylor's position. And what I take from Taylor is this relational emphasis, which I find very important. I could agree in a general sense with what you said about autonomy and about the capacity for the subject to, let's say, assume these changes. I would say this is very close to the Gracia's position on enhancement and autonomy. Of course, this touches on other points that would be very long to tackle, but what I would say is that even if I agree with this point, I find this emphasis on self-determination to be too individualistic. I don't think we can think about these things without taking into account the others. The fact that, as I said, the identity is relational. And this is something I would say quite important with one of the points that you said that is crucial, that it's really important. The idea of this assuming the changes, of integrating the changes, and the abruptness, if the change is very abrupt or not. All these things are always considered not individually, but also taking into account the human environment. We assess these things depending on what others say about it. It's not only what I feel about it, but what others tell me about it. So So yeah, I would say that this is key. I would say that my position on identity, what I believe about identity, is closer to these authors I was mentioning about, like Baylis and Shedman. I'm not fully, I don't fully agree with Taylor. I'm not sure Taylor defends a substantial notion of the good life. I think that's debatable, but in any case, I was not trying to bring Taylor's proposal of authenticity as the key solution. I was only emphasizing this relational point. And yeah, I agree that that it really depends on the capacity of the subject, but also the human environment to assume, to accept, to integrate these changes. That is the key to consider ethically all these new technologies and their impact.
Can I come in on that?
You have a question, Stephen?
Yeah, just to follow up on that conversation.
Okay.
I think I agreed with a lot of what Francisco was saying about a kind of procedural account of authenticity rather than, so for me, the problem with talking about authenticity is that sometimes it's like a comparison where you say, here's the real thing, here's the new version. Is it similar enough? But I think a procedural account works better where you have to account for, one has to account for oneself. But I don't think about it in terms of self-determination. That's where I differ. I think of it more in terms of self-explication. So if I can explain why I'm this way as opposed to that way, that accounts for the community-facing dimensions of identity. The authenticity comes from having a consistency over time about the explanation you can give for why you're now behaving this way as opposed to that way in the past, and that can kind of accommodate enhancement technologies, because even when things go wrong, so if my deep brain stimulator makes me behave in ways I don't respect anymore, I may still have a reason why I would nevertheless choose to use the deep brain stimulation, because, as you said, I'm not myself, but it's better. So maybe I value the loss of the tremors over the depression or mania that comes about. But it's based in how I can explain the course of my life, and that implies other people as well. So it's kind of procedural plus community facing.
Okay. Well, I have two questions to all of you. So, because we are very interested in the question about if there is some distinction between rehabilitation and enhancement, because there is a huge misunderstanding about what does it mean enhancement. And in some sense, in the last presentation of Belén and John, their idea about weak transhumanism is close related to my understanding of rehabilitation, because in that kind of transhumanism, the technology is focused on welfare, on reducing harm and peril, and not rather than perfection. No, the idea of some strong idea about transhumanism, which is linked to perfection. So I would like to know your opinion about that distinction between rehabilitation, enhancement, and the under ideas of welfare or perfection. No? This is one question. Another question related for the four presentations is about what do you think about is needed a new kind of human rights, of some kind of neuro rights like that posed by Rafael Juste or others. do you think that it's needed? Because European Commission is very worried about the issue of the introducing new human rights related to enhancement. No, so that's two great questions, and as you want to answer, you have the word.
All right, I should pick your question about rehabilitation and enhancement distinction. In this paper with Belen, we do not directly address this controversy because I think that it's not strictly necessary to our argument, because mainly we are dealing with how we should approach the enhancement project in relation to transhumanist proposals. But I think that at some level is pertinent because vulnerability could be diminished by therapeutic interventions, enhancement interventions, social interventions, environmental interventions. And for example, tomorrow in the talk that we have, Pablo, Francisco, and I, we are going to speak a little bit about it. For example, from a naturalistic account in medicine, where it is defended that the goal of medicine is restoring normal function, and enhancement is what leads to a healthy subject, to a normal healthy subject to an upper capacity in a statistical sense. Sometimes it's descriptively not easy to put the limit between enhancement and distinction in this framework. And we also think that in that context, it is not normatively important. Another account to the treatment enhancement distinction is from welfarism. According to welfarist authors such as Sabulescu, Kahane, Samber, all kinds of for them, enhancement could be a subclass of any well-being intervention. An enhancement is something that increases the well-being of an individual. In this sense, some therapeutic interventions could be also enhancements because they increase their well-being. And so I think that in this context, we think that it was not very important to commit to one or the other conception of the enhancement and treatment distinction. And I think that Blanca is going to speak tomorrow about it. I'm sure that it is going to shed light about this problematic distinction better than I could do it now.
More answers, or whoever want to answer this question or the other question about neuro rights?
Not neuro rights specifically, but there's another European project called Sienna. I don't know if you've heard of it.
Yes, I know
Yeah.
it.
That I was just going to mention that they have produced guidelines for human enhancement, which is quite interesting. They're very well done.
Yes, it's a very good project. Yes, they are finishing now the project. More comments, or questions, or answers, or whatever you want. You are tired now, so if there is no more questions, we can finish without problem. In fact, I can stop the recording, and at this moment